Hi there. So in this video, we're going to take a look at what are some of the policy responses to monopolies and how do they interact with surplus and what are we supposed to do with monopolies right now that we've kind of learned a little bit more about them. So to begin with, I'm going to show you some graphs that are color coded here in the pictures below. We don't need to necessarily draw them over here, but keeping them in mind might be helpful. So the first thing I'm going to show you is actually a natural monopoly. And I'm not going to actually draw the profit rectangle because we already know how to do that part. But we'll kind of assume for our purposes that it is earning a profit. We'll have that marginal revenue coming down. And so the first one we're going to do is actually this one, the natural monopoly earning a profit. And so we should see like here's marginal cost equals the supply curve for this firm. And we'll just do one of these for ATC. And we know that this kind of a firm is going to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost right there. And so that's going to be Q star. And we know that it will typically price up on here on the demand curve. And so that's going to be P star. That's what it's going to do all by itself, right? And so in our picture below, you can actually see we have a deadweight loss rectangle that results. And that's because we're not producing where supply and demand intercept. Remember, from when we talked about the idea of surpluses, it's like you have this total surplus, and when you're not producing the quantity where supply and demand intercept, then you have deadweight loss. And we can actually see supply and demand intercept way over here at this quantity. And so we have this great big deadweight loss triangle in here. And so that's a problem, right? We would say that monopolies, even in that circumstance, what would a perfectly competitive market charge? Will be where supply and demand intercept. So this would be like, this would be the price that would be perfect competition. And we'd actually say, this would be the optimal quantity that a market would generate. So monopolies underproduce compared to what a perfectly competitive or optimal market would produce. They produce a lot less. And a perfectly competitive or optimal, right? This is the optimal price. Well, they price way higher. So we do say monopolies overcharge and underproduce, and that causes deadweight loss. So we could actually have more total surplus if these doggone monopolies weren't failing. So this is a great example where monopolies are a market failure. Even a natural monopoly leads to deadweight loss. And so markets aren't perfect, right? Sometimes they fail all by themselves. It doesn't have anything to do with government. They sometimes can just fail, and this is a great example of it. Now, we can actually eliminate this problem if we said to this monopolist, you're allowed to charge different consumers different prices based on their willingness to pay, and that actually would eliminate the problem of deadweight loss, but it also eliminates all of the consumer surplus. We're going to look at that one in a different video, in one of the practice videos where I think it's a little easier to see. Now we'll go ahead and see what a artificial monopoly would look like, and it's a similar problem, right? They don't produce where supply and demand intercept. So even when they're the artificial ones, you still have that same, throw down like that, but we'd have like a marginal cost equals the supply curve. Well, they should be producing right here, right? They should be there, but instead they're where marginal revenue equals the marginal cost, and they price higher. They price way up here. And so this is the P star where they actually produce, but we know that the optimal would be right here, right? That's the optimal. And so, and I'm going to kind of right there, that would be like Q optimal. Now I'm going to go ahead and add an ATC on here as well. So we can see, here we'd say coming down, hits its minimum, and then comes back up again. And so this would be the optimal right there. And that's where supply and demand intercept. That would be the point where there wouldn't be any deadweight loss. But we can see from the picture below, the red triangle, that's the deadweight loss. It goes from the quantity that the market is producing up this curve here and over, and you can actually see the deadweight loss right there. Now, what do we do about that, right? If we're like, oh man, this is a market failure, we're not at the right number, well, you could tax them, right? That's always the temptation. You go, yeah, we ought to tax those pesky monopolies. They're always taking our money, overcharging. Yeah, let's do it. So what if we tax them? Let's see what would happen. If we put a per unit tax in, it's going to cause the two supply curves to shift up by the amount of the tax. So look at what happens to the deadweight loss and the price that the buyers pay. Boom, it's higher, right? The price is higher. Whoops. So we were here before the tax. That should say PM before the tax. And what happens? Higher price and we get more deadweight loss. So kind of one more time here where it's nice and clear, before and after. And that's worse, right? You have a bigger deadweight loss. This is before and after, huge deadweight loss. So we would say we don't want to put in per unit taxes because it's going to reduce the quantity and drive up the price. It's going to make the consumers less happy. It's going to create less transactions. It's going to make the problem worse. We could do a lump sum tax, but that's not going to change any of the quantities. So it's not going to affect the deadweight loss. It's just going to take away the monopoly's profit, which might be, it might be like, oh, that makes me feel better, but it's not going to fix the problem of socially optimal, right? You're not going to be at supply and demand. So we wouldn't say we'd recommend taxing monopolies, even though you might be tempted to as a good politician. So we have some policy options, and they actually depend on what kind of monopoly we're working with. With a natural monopoly, I'm going to give you a few options. Number one is do nothing. And that may not always be the most tempting option if you're, there's kind of kids who often are like, oh, we ought to do something and fix problems. Sometimes the cure is worse than the disease. And so do nothing should be considered as an option. The second would be you should have public ownership. Literally, the government should come in, buy this monopoly, whatever it is, maybe the water company or the electric company, and operate it. And they would operate it so that they just go ahead and price at this perfectly competitive or optimal price, and you would say we're going to produce this quantity, and the problem with that is notice that the ATC is higher at that quantity, right? Price is less than the ATC, so we know that means they're losing money. So typically, right, if you have the government operating a natural monopoly like that, they're going to lose money. And there are some people that aren't comfortable with that. But at the same time, well, that's the price of socially optimal, is that you'd have to subsidize it. The other problem with that is that sometimes, sorry, this is where I'm at here, you'd have more efficiency. You would have that supply equals the demand. You'd be at that quantity where supply equals demand. But often there's higher ATCs in some cases, not always, right? In some cases. And sometimes it's subject to political pressure. If your city government runs the water company, maybe, the mayor's brother gets a job at the water company. He might not be the best guy for the job, but he's the mayor's brother. So sometimes we worry about that with public ownership as well. Now, there are two other options that allow you to kind of combine the market with a government intervention that actually solves the problem. And so we'd say fix the price. So these are the price regulation options. The first one would be to put a price ceiling in right here where the ATC line is. And so for us, that would be right here. You'd say, let's put a price ceiling in right there, right? And if we put a price ceiling here at that level, then they're going to go ahead and produce this quantity. And we call that the fair return quantity. And that's because at that level, where if they said you can't charge P star, they force them to price P ceiling, right? Or price fair is the other way we could say this. Then they're going to produce quantity fair, and now they're going to break even. So this is what we call the fair return, or the break even, or the price equals the ATC point. And you can see from the graph below and from here, you would still have a little bit of deadweight loss, right? Because you're still not quite over to Q opt, you're at Q fair. So you still have some deadweight loss, but the consumers are way happier. Look at the picture below, right? The price is way lower and they're happier. And so you've gotten closer to socially optimal. And so a lot of times that's what governments do, is they put in a price ceiling and they say, you can't charge more than your ATC for the production cost. Now, one thing to observe about this isn't actually telling these companies you can't earn a accounting profit. They still do. A lot of times they do. Like Ameren, for example, the electric company. It's a private company, but they're regulated. And if they want to raise their price, they have to go before the government and say, please let us charge a higher price. And the government says, well, you seem to be doing okay. So they're still usually turning an accounting profit. They're just getting in zero economic profit, which eliminates a lot of the concerns most of the time. Now, another option would be if you really want that socially optimal quantity where supply equals demand, you put a price ceiling in and you push the price even lower. And that would be put that price ceiling in here at P opt or P perf, right? P perfect. And that would look like this, where you push it way down low at that socially optimal or allocative efficient. And that's here. And we can see that where supply equals demand, right? That's this level. You would then be telling this monopolist you're going to produce at this price, and then they result in this quantity as a result. The problem with that is they're going to be losing money, right? You can actually see it in the graph below as well, that the price is below the ATC, and we still have that problem here as well. And so the downside of this, if you said, you know what, Ameren, you're going to charge P opt, P perfect, In that circumstance, you'd actually have to subsidize the monopolist if you're the government, or else they can't continue to operate in the long run. So it's problematic, right? Because ATC is going to be higher than price at that level. And usually, even if you're the politician and you're saying, well, we're going to tell them they can't charge a very high price, and we're going to give them millions of dollars every year, it's a little politically a hard sell. So oftentimes they kind of compromise, policymakers do, and they just choose this middle one. Now, we don't normally break up a natural monopoly because you don't want to have two different water companies or three different electric companies all serving the same geographic area. It doesn't make any sense to do that. And so we wouldn't necessarily break up a natural monopoly. Now, a non-natural or a artificial, right? We kind of use that word non-natural. It's a little funny. An artificial monopoly policy option, you can regulate them with price controls the same way, or you can break them up. Or you can prevent their formation. And actually, we just recently saw Google get sued because the government believes that they are a artificial monopoly and they're abusing their monopoly power. So you could regulate their prices, and I'm going to show you what that would look like too, right? You could put in a price ceiling here at P opt, and you could say this is the optimal. Now the nice thing about that is that if you forced this artificial monopoly to charge P opt, well, that's actually still above the ATC, right? At that price. If you said you're going to charge this price, you go down from there at Q opt, well, the ATC is less. So in fact, the monopolist should still be pretty happy with that outcome because you're going to let them continue to exist and continue to earn profits, and it's a socially optimal outcome. You could also force this monopolist to produce at P fair. That exists here. That's the fair price. And you would do that with like a little price ceiling as well, just like in the other graph. I don't want to do it because it'll get kind of messy. The strange thing about that would be is that one actually would generate deadweight loss because you'd have too many transactions, right? At this P fair level, the price doesn't, or the demand and the supply aren't equal to each other because way up here is supply and down here is demand. So there wouldn't be any good reason actually to push them even that far low. But you could do P opt and solve the socially optimal problem. Okay, so the other parts of these little acts and things like that, the last thing I want to say is you can read up on those in your textbook. Those are the page numbers, but those don't appear on any of the exams. Those are just kind of the background to antitrust policy. So hopefully this helps you. We'll do some practice with it, get even better with it. I'll see you next time.